A young black girl sat in the plush leather of first-class seat 3B, her faded green backpack tucked tightly at her feet. Amaya Carter, just 16, felt the golden glow of the cabin lights warm her cheeks. Her gray hoodie, worn thin from years of use, seemed out of place among tailored suits and glittering jewelry. She clutched her boarding pass, the ink still crisp, a gift from her godmother, Naomi Brooks, who believed Amaya deserved every inch of this moment. Her heart fluttered with pride, the kind that came from outshining hundreds in a summer science program. Outside, the Dallas-Fort Worth runway shimmered under hazy sunlight, a promise of her first solo flight, a milestone of independence. She adjusted her headphones, music off, her favorite science book open on her lap, savoring the quiet thrill of belonging. This was her space, earned through sleepless nights and relentless effort. She belonged here. The sharp click of heels sliced through the hum of the air conditioning. Sandra Whitmore, head flight attendant, strode down the aisle, her polished uniform gleaming, her name tag a badge of authority. Her rehearsed smile, perfected over 15 years, faltered as her eyes landed on Amaya. A flicker of doubt, cold and fleeting, crossed her face, like a shadow passing over the sun. Without a word, she stopped at seat 3B, looming over Amaya, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "You're in the wrong seat." The words weren't a question, they were a command, sharp and final, as if Amaya's presence was a mistake that needed erasing. Amaya flinched, her warm eyes meeting Sandra's icy stare. "I think this is my seat, 3B, she said softly, her voice steady but small, the politeness she'd been taught since childhood holding firm. Sandra's arms crossed, her gaze narrowing, lips curling into a thin line. "This is first class, young lady." The phrase, young lady, dripped with disdain, a deliberate jab that echoed in the silent cabin. Amaya's fingers tightened on her backpack strap, her heart pounding as she reached for her boarding pass, holding it out with trembling, the glossy sleeve catching the light. The print was clear, seat 3B, first class, undeniable proof of her right to be there. Sandra barely glanced at it, her eyes flicking over the pass for a fleeting second before snapping back to Amaya. "No way. Move to economy. Now." The command landed like a slap, each word a public erasure of Amaya's pride, her achievement, her place. The cabin froze. Whispers died. Passengers in tailored suits and pearl earrings glanced over, some with curiosity, others with subtle disapproval, their eyes darting away as if Amaya's humiliation was contagious. No one spoke. No one questioned. The silence was heavier than Sandra's words, a collective refusal to see the injustice unfolding before them. Sandra gestured sharply, her manicured hand slicing the air. "Take your bag. You're holding us up." The words cut deeper than any blade, piercing Amaya's chest, stripping away the quiet pride she'd carried moments ago. Her small hand gripped the backpack strap, knuckles whitening, as a single question burned in her mind. Was it because of my skin? But she didn't voice it. She knew better, speaking up in this moment would only twist her into the problem, the troublemaker, the one who didn't belong. Amaya stood, her sneakers silent on the thick carpet, her shoulders hunching slightly under the weight of every gaze. She walked past rows of averted eyes, past expensive cologne and leather briefcases, each step a reminder of the space she'd been forced to leave. The shame wasn't just Sandra's doing, it was the silence, the complicity of every passenger who saw but chose to look away. In economy, she slumped into a window seat, her reflection staring back from the glass, small and shadowed. Her backpack rested at her feet, its faded green a quiet tether to the girl she'd been before this moment. No one in economy asked if she was okay. No one noticed the hurt in her eyes, the way her hands clasped tightly in her lap, holding herself together. She gripped her phone, fingers trembling, and unlocked the screen. Her breath caught as she typed a single message to Naomi, each word a raw truth she could barely bear to send. "They made me leave my seat. Said I don't belong in first class. I'm in economy now." She hit send, the soft click of the button echoing in her chest like a heartbeat. Outside, the runway stretched endlessly under the hazy sun, indifferent to the storm brewing within her. Amaya's eyes lingered on her reflection, searching for the girl who'd boarded this plane with pride. But they didn't know, Amaya Carter was no ordinary passenger. What would her message unleash? Amaya Carter's reflection wavered in the airplane window, her brown eyes tracing the faint outline of her face against the hazy Dallas-Fort Worth runway. The economy cabin's dim light cast shadows over her faded gray hoodie, her small frame sinking deeper into the worn seat. Her fingers, still trembling from the sting of Sandra Whitmore's words, traced the frayed strap of her green backpack, a relic of countless battles won through late-night study sessions and relentless determination. The first-class ticket, now tucked inside her pocket, felt heavier than ever, not a symbol of pride, but a reminder of how quickly her place could be erased. The hum of the grounded plane's engines vibrated through her, but it was the silence of the cabin, the weight of those averted gazes from first class, that pressed against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She closed her eyes, and memories flooded in, sharp and unbidden. Her mother's voice, soft but fierce, echoed from years ago, her hands braiding Amaya's hair under the glow of a kitchen lamp. "They'll try to push you out, baby, but you hold your ground. You're enough, always." Her mother, gone too soon, had been her anchor, the one who taught her to stand tall in rooms where she was the only black girl, the only one who didn't fit. Amaya had carried that lesson into science fairs, into classrooms where teachers raised eyebrows at her ambition, into a summer program where she'd outshone hundreds to earn that first-class ticket. Naomi Brooks, her godmother, had handed her the boarding pass with a smile that said, "This is yours. Claim it." But now, sitting in economy, Amaya felt the ground slipping beneath her. Had she been naive to believe effort could shield her from a world that saw her hoodie and sneakers and decided she didn't belong? Her chest ached, not with anger but with a quiet grief, a mourning for the girl she'd been an hour ago, the one who'd boarded Flight 263 with a heart full of possibility. Sandra's voice looped in her mind, cold and cutting. "Young lady." The words weren't just a dismissal, they were a verdict, a reminder of every time she'd been made to feel less than, every time she'd had to prove her worth twice over. She opened her eyes, staring at the runway's endless stretch, the haze blurring the horizon. Was this what her mother had warned her about? The moment when the world's weight would try to crush her spirit? Her fingers tightened on the backpack strap, the fabric worn soft from years of carrying her dreams. She wanted to fight, to march back to first class and demand her seat, but doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she'd been wrong to think she could belong there. A soft buzz broke the spiral of her thoughts. Her phone lit up, the screen glowing in the dim cabin. Naomi's message was simple, 2 words that landed like a lifeline in a storm. What happened? The question wasn't just curiosity, it was a promise, a reminder that someone, somewhere, believed in her without needing proof. Amaya's breath caught, her heart pounding as she stared at the words. Naomi wasn't just her godmother, she was a woman who'd faced down giants in the aviation industry, a director at the FAA whose principles were as unyielding as steel. Those 2 words carried the weight of everything Naomi had taught her, to stand firm, to speak truth, to never let the world define her worth. Amaya's fingers hovered over the screen, the weight of the moment pressing down. She typed slowly, each word a deliberate act of reclaiming her voice. The head flight attendant said I don't belong in first class. She didn't check my ticket. I'm in economy now. Her thumb lingered over the send button, her reflection in the phone's glass showing a girl caught between hurt and resolve. She pressed send, the soft click echoing in her chest like a door unlocking. The cabin's oppressive silence seemed to lift, just a fraction, as if the air itself knew something was shifting. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its light cutting through the haze, casting a faint glow on her face. She didn't know what Naomi would do, but she knew her godmother's love was a force that could move mountains, or ground planes. Her eyes drifted to the backpack at her feet, its faded green a tether to her past. It had been her mother's once, carried through her own struggles, through moments when she'd been told she didn't belong. Amaya's fingers brushed the strap, a quiet vow to herself. She wouldn't let this moment define her. She wouldn't let Sandra's prejudice steal the pride she'd earned. But the ache remained, a cold knot in her chest, a fear that no matter how hard she worked, the world would always find a way to push her back. The plane's engines hummed softly, still at the gate, as if waiting for something, or someone, to decide its fate. Amaya's gaze returned to the window, her reflection sharper now, her eyes holding a flicker of defiance. What would happen when Naomi read those words? The economy cabin of Flight 263 felt like a shadowed afterthought, its dim overhead lights casting a muted glow over Amaya Carter's small frame. She sat by the window, her faded gray hoodie blending into the worn seat, her green backpack a silent sentinel at her feet. The Dallas-Fort Worth runway stretched beyond the glass, its haze softening the harsh sunlight, but Amaya's eyes were fixed on her phone, the screen now dark after sending her message to Naomi Brooks. Her fingers lingered on the frayed backpack strap, tracing its familiar texture, a tether to the courage her mother had instilled in her. The cabin's murmurs, the clink of seatbelts, the rustle of magazines, all of it faded into a distant hum. She was alone in her resolve, yet the weight of the first-class passenger's silence still pressed against her chest, a reminder of the injustice that had pushed her here. In the first-class cabin, the golden light bathed the plush leather seats, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and privilege. Sandra Whitmore stood in the galley, her polished uniform crisp, her red scarf tied with practiced precision. She sipped water from a plastic cup, her posture exuding control, as if the incident with Amaya was already a footnote in her 15-year career. The cabin hummed with the casual indifference of passengers flipping through glossy magazines or tapping on their phones. But not everyone was at ease. Eric Dawson, a young flight attendant with a lean frame and 3 years on the job, lingered near the galley, his cloth still in hand from wiping trays. His eyes, sharp with unease, flickered toward the economy cabin, where Amaya's silhouette was just visible by the window. Eric's steps were hesitant as he approached Sandra, his voice low, barely audible over the air conditioning's hum. "I saw her ticket. It was for 3B. The words hung in the air, not an accusation but a question, a crack in the facade of Sandra's authority. Sandra's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened, a glint of arrogance flashing through them. "Eric, you're still green. A ticket doesn't always mean they belong." Her tone was dismissive, as if she were explaining a simple truth to a child. Eric's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to the empty seat 3B, its headrest still folded back from Amaya's brief presence. The boarding pass he'd glimpsed in her hand, its glossy sleeve catching the light, had been unmistakable, seat 3B, first class. Why hadn't Sandra checked it? Why had he stayed silent when she'd ordered Amaya to move? Sandra set her cup down, adjusting her scarf with a practiced flick, oblivious to the doubt stirring in Eric's eyes. But Eric couldn't shake the image of Amaya's stillness, the way she'd held her backpack strap like a lifeline, her eyes warm but unyielding despite Sandra's cold command. There was something about her, something that didn't fit the narrative Sandra had spun. He glanced back toward economy, where Amaya sat, her head tilted slightly toward the window, her posture calm but resolute. The faded green backpack at her feet seemed out of place, yet it carried a weight Eric couldn't define, a story, a history, a truth that Sandra had dismissed with a single glance. A faint tremor ran through the plane, not from the engines but from a shift in the air, a ripple of something unseen. Eric's eyes lingered on the backpack, its worn fabric a quiet defiance against the polished elegance of first class. He didn't know who Amaya was, but her refusal to crumble, her steady walk to economy despite the cabin's silent judgment, made him question the rules he'd been taught to follow. Sandra's words echoed in his mind, "Not everyone belongs," but they felt hollow now, a justification that didn't hold up under the weight of what he'd witnessed. He stepped back from the galley, his cloth twisting in his hands, his gaze returning to seat 3B. The empty seat seemed to stare back, a silent challenge to his complicity. In the economy cabin, Amaya's phone remained dark, but her thoughts were alive, swirling with the memory of her mother's voice. "Hold your ground, baby." She'd held her ground before, in classrooms where her hand was the last raised, in science fairs where judges skimmed her name but lingered on her work. But this was different. This wasn't about proving her intellect, it was about proving her right to exist in a space she'd earned. The backpack at her feet, her mother's once, carried the weight of those lessons, its faded green a reminder of the woman who'd fought similar battles. Amaya's fingers brushed the strap, a quiet vow to herself. She wouldn't let Sandra's prejudice define her. But the doubt lingered, a cold knot in her chest, whispering that maybe she'd been wrong to think she could claim this space. Eric's gaze drifted back to Amaya, catching the way her hand rested on the backpack, her fingers steady despite the tremor he'd seen earlier. He didn't know her story, but he knew enough to sense she wasn't just a girl in a hoodie. There was a strength in her silence, a purpose in her stillness, that made him question everything Sandra had taught him about maintaining order. The plane's engines hummed softly, still grounded, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Eric's eyes narrowed, a spark of curiosity igniting. Who was she, really? And why did her presence feel like the calm before a storm? Amaya Carter sat in the dim economy cabin of Flight 263, her small frame pressed against the window, the Dallas-Fort Worth runway a hazy blur beyond the glass. Her faded gray hoodie blended into the worn seat, her green backpack a quiet anchor at her feet. The cabin's murmurs faded into a low hum, but the weight of the first-class passenger's silence lingered, a heavy reminder of the injustice that had pushed her here. Her phone, still dark after her message to Naomi Brooks, rested in her lap, its screen reflecting her steady gaze. Her fingers brushed the frayed strap of her backpack, a tether to her mother's courage, but her heart pounded with a mix of resolve and uncertainty. The plane's engines hummed softly, grounded at the gate, as if the world itself were waiting for something to break. In the first-class cabin, the golden light bathed the plush leather seats, the air thick with the scent of privilege. Sandra Whitmore stood in the galley, her polished uniform crisp, her red scarf a symbol of her authority. She sipped water from a plastic cup, her posture exuding control, believing the incident with Amaya was a minor ripple in her 15-year career. But Eric Dawson, the young flight attendant, lingered nearby, his cloth twisting in his hands, his eyes flickering toward economy. Amaya's silhouette by the window, her calm defiance, gnawed at him. He'd seen her ticket, seat 3B, first class, yet Sandra had dismissed it without a second glance. His quiet challenge, "I saw her ticket," had been brushed off, but the doubt in his chest grew, a seed of suspicion that Amaya was more than she seemed. A sharp beat pierced the cockpit's calm. Captain Robert Hayes frowned at the dashboard, a red message flashing with unmistakable urgency. FAA directive. Hold at the gate. His first officer raised an eyebrow, but Hayes shook his head, his voice low. This isn't technical. It's from the top. He pressed the intercom, his tone steady but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're holding at the gate for a brief procedure. Please remain seated. The announcement echoed through the cabin, and in the galley, Sandra's cup trembled in her hand, the condensation cold against her skin. Her eyes darted to the cockpit door, a flicker of unease stirring in her chest. The plane was grounded, but why? The absence of maintenance crews, the eerie silence, felt like a warning she couldn't ignore. Amaya's phone buzzed, the screen glowing in the dim light. Naomi's message was short, electric. Stay where you are. Let me handle it. Amaya's breath caught, her fingers loosening on the backpack strap. She knew Naomi wasn't just her godmother, she was a director at the FAA, a woman whose single call could shift the skies. The cabin's oppressive silence seemed to crack, and Amaya sat straighter, her eyes fixed on the runway, where the haze parted to reveal a sharper horizon. In that moment, the truth ignited like a flare, Amaya wasn't just a teen in a hoodie. She was Naomi Brooks' goddaughter, and her quiet stand was about to ground an entire system. In a glass-walled office in Washington, D.C., Naomi Brooks stood, her navy coat draped over her chair, her gaze sharp as she read Amaya's message. She didn't check my ticket. Her fingers dialed the FAA's emergency line, her voice like steel. Hold Flight 263. Priority complaint. Discriminatory behavior against a minor. The command was swift, unyielding, and within minutes, the plane's engine stilled, federal agents dispatched to the tarmac. Naomi's eyes, steady and fierce, scanned the flight tracking screen, where Flight 263's icon sat motionless, a single dot in a web of moving lights. This wasn't just about Amaya's seat, it was about a system that had failed her, and Naomi would make it answer. In the cockpit, Hayes received a second message, his brow furrowing as he read the details. Passenger Amaya Carter, Seat 3B, minor, verified ticket. Removed without verification. FAA investigation active. He turned to the first officer, his voice low. This came from Naomi Brooks herself. The name carried weight, a legend in aviation known for her unwavering principles. Hayes called for Sandra, his tone clipped. Miss Whitmore, to the cockpit. Sandra's heels clicked as she entered, her smile strained, but the headset Hayes handed her froze her in place. The voice on the other end was cold, precise. This is James Sandler, FAA, on behalf of Director Naomi Brooks. You removed Amaya Carter, a minor, from her valid first-class seat without verification. Do you know she's the goddaughter of the FAA director? Sandra's breath hitched, her face paling as the words sank in. I didn't verify, she stammered, her voice cracking. Sandler's tone left no room for excuses. You relied on intuition, not procedure. You'll escort Amaya back to 3B and apologize publicly. Then you'll face a federal investigation. The headset went silent, the static replaced by a roar in Sandra's ears. Her hands trembled as she removed it, the cockpit's cool air suffocating. Amaya wasn't just a girl, she was connected to a power Sandra hadn't imagined, and her single text had unleashed a storm. Sandra's steps back to the cabin were heavy, each one stripping away her authority. The passenger's eyes followed her, no longer admiring but scrutinizing, sensing the shift in the air. She stopped before Amaya in economy, her voice thin, unsteady. There's been a misunderstanding. Please return to seat 3B. Amaya looked up, her eyes calm but piercing, a quiet strength radiating from her. Why was I the only one you checked? The question was a blade, cutting through Sandra's facade, exposing her bias to the silent cabin. Passengers shifted, their gazes sharpening, the weight of Amaya's truth hanging like a spotlight. Sandra's lips trembled, her excuses dissolving. It was a mistake, she whispered, but the words rang hollow, a confession of prejudice laid bare. Amaya stood, her backpack over her shoulder, her step steady as she walked back to first class. The cabin watched in slow motion, every eye on her small frame, her faded hoodie a stark contrast to the luxury around her. Sandra followed, her head bowed, her authority crumbling with each step. The empty seat 3B waited, its headrest still folded back, as if it had always known she'd return. Amaya sat, her posture straight, her hands resting on her thighs, her presence a quiet earthquake. The cabin's golden light seemed to brighten, illuminating the truth she'd forced into the open. But what would this revelation mean for those who'd stayed silent? Amaya Carter settled into the plush leather of seat 3B, the first-class cabin's golden light casting a soft glow on her faded gray hoodie. Her green backpack rested at her feet, its frayed strap a quiet testament to her resilience. The Dallas-Fort Worth runway shimmered beyond the window, but Amaya's eyes were steady, fixed on the horizon, her small frame radiating a calm that silenced the cabin's murmurs. The hum of the grounded plane's engines faded into the background, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to hold the air itself. Sandra Whitmore stood at the edge of the galley, her polished uniform no longer a shield, her red scarf slightly askew. Her face, pale and strained, betrayed the unraveling of her 15-year authority, her lips trembling as Amaya's question, "Why was I the only one you checked?" echoed in the minds of every passenger who'd witnessed her public apology. The cabin's silence was a living thing, heavy with the weight of unspoken shame. Passengers who'd averted their eyes when Amaya was forced to economy now struggled to meet her gaze. The woman with pearl earrings fumbled with her handbag, her fingers restless, as if searching for an excuse to avoid the truth seated just rows away. The gray-haired man by the window stared out, his jaw tight, his reflection revealing a flicker of regret. No one spoke, but their discomfort was palpable, a collective reckoning with their earlier indifference. Amaya sat straight, her hands resting lightly on her thighs, her presence a quiet indictment, not of anger, but of dignity that demanded to be seen. She didn't need to raise her voice, her return to 3B was a statement louder than any words. Sandra's hands clenched behind her back, her nails digging into her palms as she stood frozen in the galley. The passengers' eyes, once admiring her authority, now judged her, their whispers like needles pricking her skin. She'd believed her actions were routine, a necessary correction of an anomaly in her perfectly ordered cabin. But Amaya's question had stripped that illusion away, exposing the prejudice she'd cloaked in professionalism. Her chest tightened, a cold realization settling in. She hadn't just made a mistake, she'd violated something deeper, something human. Yet Amaya offered no glare, no accusation. Her calm gaze, fixed on the runway, was worse. It was a mirror, forcing Sandra to see herself as she truly was. Eric Dawson, the young flight attendant, watched from the galley's edge, his cloth forgotten in his hand. His eyes, bright with a mix of guilt and resolve, lingered on Amaya. He'd stayed silent when Sandra ordered her to move, but her return to 3B stirred something in him, a need to act, to make amends, however small. He stepped forward, his movements tentative, and placed a glass of water on Amaya's tray, his nod subtle but deliberate. "For you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Amaya's fingers brushed the glass, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment, a quiet acknowledgement that didn't demand more. Eric stepped back, his shoulders straighter, as if that small gesture had lifted a weight he hadn't known he carried. The cabin's tension shifted, a fragile crack in the wall of silence. A young man in seat 2C, his salt and pepper hair catching the light, leaned toward his wife, his voice low but clear. "We were silent in the wrong way." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the rows. The woman beside him nodded, her hand squeezing his, her eyes darting to Amaya with a mix of awe and shame. Others stirred, their movements small but telling, a man adjusting his glasses, a woman setting down her magazine, their faces softening as if waking from a collective trance. Amaya's stand hadn't just exposed Sandra's bias, it had forced them to confront their own complicity, their failure to speak when it mattered. Sandra's gaze dropped to the galley floor, the stainless steel reflecting her distorted image. The whispers, the glances, the weight of Eric's quiet defiance, they pressed against her, unraveling the confidence she'd worn like armor. She wanted to explain, to justify, to say it was a reflex, a misunderstanding. But the truth was inescapable, she'd seen Amaya's hoodie, her sneakers, her skin, and decided she didn't belong. No procedure, no verification, just a snap judgment that had grounded a plane and shattered her career. Her throat tightened, a lump forming as she realized no apology could undo what she'd set in motion. She turned away, her back to the cabin, her hands gripping the counter, but there was no escape from the eyes that now saw her clearly. Amaya remained still, her hands steady on her thighs, her backpack a quiet companion. She didn't revel in Sandra's humiliation or the passengers' discomfort. Her fight wasn't for revenge, it was for her place, her right to exist without proving herself twice over. The glass of water from Eric, the young man's whispered confession, the subtle nods from others, they weren't triumphs, but small steps toward a world that might listen. Her heart lifted, not with pride, but with a fragile hope that her stand had cracked open a door, however slightly. Outside, the runway's haze seemed to clear, the sunlight sharper, as if the world itself were acknowledging her truth. The cabin's golden light felt different now, not warm but stark, illuminating the faces of those who'd failed to act. A teenage girl across the aisle, her phone forgotten, stared at Amaya with wide eyes, her lips parting as if to speak. She didn't, but her gaze held a quiet reverence, a spark of understanding that hadn't been there before. The man in 2C shifted, his voice softer now, almost to himself. "She made us see." His wife's hand tightened on his, a silent agreement. The cabin wasn't healed, not yet, but it was awake, stirred by a 16-year-old girl who'd refused to shrink. Amaya's eyes drifted to her backpack, its faded green a reminder of her mother's battles she was now carrying forward. But what would happen when the plane's doors opened, and the world beyond confronted her stand? Amaya Carter sat in seat 3B, the first-class cabin's golden light softening the edges of her faded gray hoodie. Her green backpack rested at her feet, its frayed strap a quiet emblem of her journey. The Dallas-Fort Worth runway stretched beyond the window, its haze now parting under a sharper sun, as if the world itself were clearing to witness her stand. The cabin's silence lingered, no longer oppressive but heavy with a new awareness, stirred by her return and Sandra Whitmore's public unraveling. Amaya's hands rested lightly on her thighs, her posture straight, her brown eyes steady, not with triumph but with a calm that seemed to anchor the entire plane. The glass of water Eric Dawson had placed on her tray caught the light, a small gesture that felt like a bridge, a step toward healing the wound inflicted hours ago. The passengers, once indifferent, now carried a subtle shift in their demeanor. The woman with pearl earrings no longer fumbled with her handbag, her hands were still, her gaze flickering toward Amaya with a mix of respect and regret. The gray-haired man by the window turned inward, his reflection revealing a quiet reckoning. Whispers had faded, replaced by a fragile stillness, as if the cabin were holding its breath, learning to breathe in the presence of Amaya's dignity. Eric stood at the galley's edge, his cloth tucked away, his eyes bright with a resolve that hadn't existed before. His small act, offering Amaya the water, had been a spark, a refusal to stay silent any longer. He watched her now, not as a passenger, but as a force who'd reshaped the air around them. Amaya's heart, once heavy with the sting of Sandra's prejudice, felt lighter, not from victory but from clarity. She hadn't fought to humiliate anyone, she'd fought to reclaim her place, to prove that her worth wasn't tied to a hoodie or sneakers but to the work she'd poured into every moment that led her here. Her mother's voice echoed softly, a memory from years ago under a kitchen lamp. "You're enough, baby. Always." That truth had carried her through classrooms, science fairs, and now this cabin, where her quiet stand had forced a reckoning. She glanced at her backpack, its faded green a link to her mother's own battles fought in spaces that tried to push her out. Amaya's fingers brushed the strap, a silent promise to carry that strength forward, not just for herself but for others who'd been told they didn't belong. A soft cough broke the stillness. A teenage girl across the aisle, her phone forgotten in her lap, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and hesitation. She was younger than Amaya, maybe 14, her braids neatly tied, her hands fidgeting as if searching for courage. "Thank you," she mouthed, her voice too soft to carry but her gaze unwavering. Amaya's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. The girl's lips curved into a shy smile, her shoulders relaxing as if Amaya's presence had given her permission to dream bigger. Amaya didn't smile back, but her nod was gentle, a quiet affirmation that the girl's gratitude mattered, that her stand had reached beyond seat 3B. The young man in seat 2C, who'd whispered about their wrong silence, shifted, his voice low but clear. She didn't need to shout. She just was. His wife nodded, her hand resting on his, her eyes lingering on Amaya with a warmth that hadn't been there before. The cabin's golden light seemed to soften, wrapping Amaya in a glow that felt like acceptance, not of her right to the seat, but of her right to be seen. The passengers' earlier indifference had cracked, revealing a willingness to listen, to learn, to carry this moment beyond the plane. Amaya's chest rose with a slow breath, her heart settling into a rhythm of hope. She hadn't changed the world, but she'd changed this cabin, and that was enough for now. Eric stepped forward again, his movements deliberate, and adjusted the tray table for a passenger nearby, but his eyes kept returning to Amaya. He'd seen her ticket, her truth, and done nothing, until now. His small gesture with the water had been a start, but the resolve in his gaze promised more. He'd never stay silent again, not when prejudice hid behind procedure. The teenage girl across the aisle clutched her phone, her fingers hovering as if tempted to capture this moment, but she didn't. Instead, she watched Amaya, her eyes bright with a lesson no textbook could teach: courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it sits quietly, unyielding, in a first-class seat. Amaya's thoughts drifted to Naomi Brooks, her godmother, whose message had sparked this reckoning. Naomi's love, fierce and unwavering, had given her the strength to send that text, to hold her ground when the world tried to push her out. She imagined Naomi in her Washington office, her navy coat draped over a chair, her sharp gaze tracking Flight 263 stationary. This wasn't just about Amaya's seat, it was about every girl like her, every person told they didn't belong. Amaya's hand rested on her backpack, its weight a reminder of her mother's battles, now hers to carry forward. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to feel the space she'd reclaimed, to let it heal the ache that Sandra's words had left behind. The cabin's stillness deepened, a sacred pause before the world beyond the plane intruded. The passengers, stirred by Amaya's presence, began to move, their actions small but deliberate, a man setting down his magazine, a woman tucking away her phone, their faces softer, as if they'd glimpsed something worth carrying forward. The teenage girl across the aisle leaned back, her shy smile lingering, her eyes promising to remember this moment. Amaya opened her eyes, her gaze steady on the runway, where the sunlight now burned bright, cutting through the haze. She was no longer the girl who'd boarded this plane, naive and hopeful. She was stronger, forged in the fire of her own resilience. But what would happen when she stepped off this plane, into a world that might not yet be ready for her truth? The first-class cabin of Flight 263 basked in a golden glow, its plush leather seats now empty, the hum of the air conditioning a faint echo in the stillness. Amaya Carter stood at the cabin door, her faded gray hoodie catching the sunlight spilling from the jet bridge. Her green backpack hung lightly over one shoulder, its frayed strap a quiet testament to the battles she'd carried, her mother's, and now her own. The Dallas-Fort Worth runway stretched beyond the plane's windows, its haze burned away by a fierce noon sun, as if the world had cleared to honor her stand. The cabin behind her held the weight of a transformed silence, no longer indifferent but alive with the lessons her presence had etched into every passenger who'd witnessed her return to seat 3B. Amaya's brown eyes, steady and deep, looked forward, her small frame radiating a strength that felt larger than the plane itself. The passengers had disembarked, their steps slow, their faces marked by a quiet reckoning. The woman with pearl earrings had paused at the door, her gaze lingering on Amaya with a nod that spoke of respect, not apology. The gray-haired man by the window had whispered to his wife, "She changed us," his voice barely audible but heavy with truth. The teenage girl across the aisle, her braids catching the light, had clutched her phone, not to record but to hold on to the courage she'd seen in Amaya's calm defiance. Eric Dawson, the young flight attendant, remained at the galley's edge, his eyes bright with a vow to never stay silent again. His small gesture, a glass of water placed on Amaya's tray, had been a spark, a step toward healing the wound Sandra Whitmore's prejudice had inflicted. The cabin, once a stage for injustice, was now a classroom, its lessons carried in the hearts of those who'd boarded as strangers. Amaya stepped onto the jet bridge, the sunlight warm against her cheeks, not blinding but welcoming, like a hand extended in trust. At the end of the bridge stood Naomi Brooks, her navy coat a beacon in the bustling airport terminal. Naomi's hair was neatly pinned, her posture elegant but unyielding, her hand resting over her heart as if to steady the pride swelling within. Amaya walked toward her, her sneakers soft on the carpet, her backpack light on her shoulder. There was no hurry, no need for grand gestures. Their eyes met, Naomi's sharp gaze softening with a warmth that needed no words. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Naomi asked, her voice low, her hand reaching for Amaya's shoulder. Amaya nodded, her voice calm but solid. "I don't need them to shout I was right. I just need them to think." Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile, her hand lingering on Amaya's shoulder, a silent affirmation of her strength. They turned and walked into the airport hallway, their steps in sync, the clatter of luggage and chatter fading into the background. No cameras waited, no reporters clamored for a story, just two women, bound by love and purpose, carrying a truth that didn't need headlines to resonate. Amaya's backpack swayed slightly, its faded green catching the light, a detail that seemed to whisper of cycles closing. It had been her mother's once, carried through her own battles against a world that tried to erase her. Years ago, her mother had been turned away from a job interview in this very airport, told she didn't fit the profile. Amaya's stand in seat 3B had done more than reclaim her place, it had honored her mother's fight, closing a wound that time alone couldn't heal. The airport's glass walls reflected their figures, a 16-year-old girl and a woman who'd reshaped the skies. Beyond the terminal, the story of Flight 263 was already rippling outward. In a Seattle high school, a black freshman would stand up after watching a video of the incident, her voice steady. She didn't need to scream. She held on, and that's why they listened. In an Atlanta symposium, Naomi would hold up a photo of Amaya in seat 3B, her words echoing. This is how a revolution begins, with a girl who refuses to leave her seat. The Amaya Carter Clause, a new FAA regulation, would bear her name, ensuring no minor would face discrimination in the skies again. But Amaya didn't know this yet. She didn't need to. Her fight wasn't for fame, it was for the right to be seen, to exist without proving herself twice over. As they walked, Naomi glanced at Amaya, her voice soft. If you could do it again, would you change anything? Amaya's eyes drifted to the airport ceiling, where sunlight streamed through skylights, painting patterns on the floor. She smiled, a light, unshakable curve of her lips. I'd still sit in 3B. And no one would make me move. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow, a promise to herself and to every girl like her. Naomi's smile deepened, her hand squeezing Amaya's shoulder, a silent pact that they'd face the world together. The backpack, its green faded but enduring, seemed to glow in the light, a final nod to the woman who'd carried it first, whose strength now lived in Amaya's unwavering stand. They stepped into the terminal's main hall, the crowd parting slightly, unaware of the revolution walking among them. Amaya's sneakers moved with purpose, her shoulders straight, her heart steady. The airport, once a place of her mother's defeat, was now a stage for her triumph, not loud, not vengeful, but profound. The story of Flight 263 would spread, not as a spectacle but as a lesson, etched into training programs, classrooms, and hearts. Amaya didn't look back at the plane, didn't need to. She'd left it changed, its silence no longer a weapon but a mirror, reflecting a truth the world could no longer ignore. As they disappeared into the crowd, the backpack's green strap caught the light one last time, a final twist revealing the cycle she'd closed. Her mother had been pushed out here, but Amaya had walked back in, and the skies would never be the same. What would the world do with the truth she'd set free?